Well, it's 9:15, so let's get started. Um, Starting on a new book for Mary. This is Untangling Our Faith by Elbert Dempsey. He's a church member. I'm not sure he's alive now. This book was written in 30 years ago in 1993, so it's been out of print for a while. But the class voted for this. This is the book that they chose as their number one choice to study. So this is where we're starting. So I'm going to cover the introduction, which just kind of gives a broad overview of what's in the book, and then chapter 1, which is tribal faith. So in his introduction, he says that he thinks his key insight is understand that modern Christianity is a tangled web. And he points out that this is going to be what we're going to study over many chapters. Is there are many strands of faith woven into the Old Testament. Some of those strands contradict other strands in the Old Testament. But most people, when they read he says most people assume that all these strands, somehow from that you get a unified Bible. But he says they contradict each other. So you really can't, trying to make it a unified Bible leads to some confusion, I think. He points out that modern science and philosophy don't support some of these strands in the Bible. I think first thought I would come is the understanding of just the creation of the universe in one sense, and how large the universe is. In ancient times, they had kind of a world where the earth was the center of the universe, and then you had the heaven. There was a dome above the earth, and it was and then there was kind of a three-level universe centered on the earth. So that's kind of something different than what modern science tells us. But he says that the strands that don't stand up to modern inquiry, like science, are what he calls peripheral strands. But the strands that do stand up to modern science are the prophetic strands. And so we're going to kind of show a contrast between the different strands. So I already shared one about the universe and the old understanding of the earth. The universe was basically the earth, and the stars were in the firmament, the dome fixed above the earth. That's one theological perspective, and it's certainly different from modern day. But what do you see as evidences in the Bible that people had different ideas actually in the Bible itself? And it could have been about the beginning of the two stories of the beginning in the Bible are different.
Yeah, Dennis, I had to go back and look it up. I think we studied before the two Genesis stories, and how one is priestly and one is Yahwist, and I couldn't remember my theology enough to know exactly why those were two different strands and who wrote each. But I do remember that the two Genesis stories, two creation stories, kind of contradict each other a little bit, which I think is kind of interesting now.
I think that was before my time.
Yeah, okay. I can't even remember. It's been so long since I've studied it. I don't remember where I studied it.
Okay. Is there anything else in the well, we're mostly talking about the Old Testament, and Dempsey, as he introduces the New Testament and modern revelations for our church every once in a while, but we're mostly in the Old Testament. Is there anything else that gives you a different theological perspective in the Old Testament? How about the book of Job?
Yeah.
This is Ryan. Dennis, can you restate your question? I'm a little unclear.
Well, the question was, can you see my screen? Ryan?
Oh, yeah. Are you on the first question there?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, Job presents, I just picked that one just randomly, but Job has a different idea of why he is suffering all these things versus his friends. There's two different theological perspectives in the book of Job. In other parts, I'm trying to think of another example. Some of the early prophets we talked about, I'm thinking of Elijah, and when he went and hid in the cave, and I heard all these things happen, but then he heard a small voice. I think he got a different idea about God from that experience. Well, if there are different strands in the Bible, do you see any benefit? See that we could benefit from understanding that there's different strands of thought in the Bible, that they're not necessarily all agreeable with each other, that sometimes they contradict. Does that give us a better understanding today? Okay,
Yeah.
moving on.
Sorry. I was thinking about that one and how I would answer it, but I think it is helpful to see where those different strands are, because you mentioned the book of Job, and that that is one of my favorite books of the Bible, but it disagrees with a lot of the wisdom literature, like the Proverbs.
Okay. Well, you'll have to talk to Jane because I don't think she likes Job.
Sorry.
Anyway,
Sorry, Ryan. I don't like Job.
Yeah. Well, I like the troublesome parts of the Bible. What can I say?
okay,
Yeah.
Ryan, good for you.
Well, I was going to say in the answer to your question a little bit that what helps me studying these strands as using Dempsey's language now is that I understand that these were all shepherds. Abraham was a shepherd and had that tribal faith, and it's important for me to look at the Bible as to who they were when it was written, and written for them. So Moses comes along and gives the 10 commandments and the one true God, but it was within this society that had multiple gods. And so it was fighting against that society. And I want to look at the Bible in its historic context. That's what the strands mean to me.
Okay, well, we're going to get into some of these variations, different things, different strands, and how they might change our thinking. So Dempsey says, this is a quote from him: "A tragedy of modern religion is that the Judeo-Christian tradition has been on a mystical tour from the prophetic faith of ancient Judah for 2,400 years." And he says this tour is in such conflict with the Mosaic faith that it's been called the Persian detour. And because of this detour, he says, some of our ideas that even today we think about prophets are the opposite of what the prophets really were or really are. So he lists in his introduction some of those popular assumptions about the prophets. What are some that come to your mind?
Well, some people think prophets are almost fortune tellers. I don't think that. Other people would think that prophets give you advice or wisdom of how you should proceed.
Could everybody hear that?
Yes.
Okay. Remember, you'll have to speak up since but you did it. That was pretty good. Sharon's sitting behind me, so she's a little bit further from our speaker. Okay. Well, here's one, where Dempsey says that the prophets taught that the future is an unwritten book whose outcome depends on how people respond to God's call. And they would bring a contemporary word of God to those people at that time to meet their needs at that time, versus apocalyptics taught that the future is predestined, and they predicted future events of suffering, miraculous deliverance, other ideas that actually came from the Zoroastrian religion of Persia. That's why they call it the Persia detour. And like Sharon was saying, the prophets were seen as soothsayers or fortune tellers who predicted the distant future using, a lot of times they used mysterious language and dramatic symbols. And that is used quite often is the book of Daniel. It has all these symbols in it that people try to interpret. So which strand do you think encourages people to act, and which strand encourages waiting for God to act?
Well, I would think that the apocalyptics would be waiting for God to act. It's like there's almost like, I want to say, sort of like predestination. It's predicting that the end is at hand, and it seems more that it's in God's hands than ours. But
So what's our part in this if we're waiting for God? What are we supposed to be doing while we're waiting for God?
Well, some people that believe in predestination would say there's not really anything you can do.
Other than maybe just that you should trust in God, that everything is going to work out for those who believe in God?
Yes.
Okay.
I think too, it can lead to a erroneous conclusion that nothing we can do can make the world a better place. And I think, people who are waiting on God to act apocalyptically would many times also say, I've just given up on, mankind's ability to fix things. So we'll leave it up to God, and then, pay attention to the prophets as the soothsayers or the foretellers to predict when that might happen. Or who's the other guy that they Nostradamus, every year I hear some new thing. Oh, Nostradamus said this, and this is the year it's supposed to happen. People are still trying to figure him out, however long ago that he lived. I think that the alternative, which is more along the Jewish tradition, the ancient prophets were calling people back to God because they believed that they had a relationship where they were co-workers with God. And as long as they were separated from God, they weren't helping to make the world a better place. But when in working, in consort with God, it was possible to fix the broken world. And I think that's the difference. It's doing nothing versus, let's do something.
Do you think most Christians prefer the more the waiting for God, or?
Well, I know lots
Or
of
working with God.
evangelicals who do, yes. I wouldn't say all Christians, because I think there, are other denominations that have kind of gone the direction of Community of Christ, that we see ourselves as kingdom builders, not just as kingdom waiters. So, yeah, I think
Well,
there
why
are
would
some
they-
groups. Go ahead.
Well, I ask you another question. Why do you think they do that, or prefer the apocalyptic strand versus the prophetic strand?
Because that's how they interpret the scripture. And
Okay.
that's exactly the premise of this book. Is he's saying, you know, that misinterpretation of scripture has led to faulty conclusions on the
Do
part
you
of many
think it-
Christians.
Okay. Do you think they find it more comforting to believe that, well, it's in God's hands and it'll all be taken care of? We don't.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think they do. I'm just speaking from, you know, evangelicals that I feel like are people I know pretty well. I
Okay.
know that's the position they would take. And they get, you know, they get a lot of comfort from it. You know, they really do. And, you know, that's great if you get comfort from it, but that doesn't fix the world either.
Okay. Doesn't lead to action necessarily.
It's, you know, it's kind of this argument that we hear a lot now with all of the horrible things that people do to one another. And, you know, everybody says, well, thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers. Well, that's fine. I mean, the spiritual aspect is important, but you know, what are we physically doing to make the world a better place, to reduce the likelihood that that kind of violence is going to diminish?
Mhm.
You know, so it's like, okay, either we'll leave it up to God, or maybe God's leaving it up to us, and we're misunderstanding.
Dempsey
Anyway,
can,
that's my thought.
okay, well, thanks. That seems to fit with some of our modern revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Dennis, it's Jane again. And
Okay.
I also wanted to point out that, and I think Mr. Dempsey is saying this, I think there is a danger when you have that apocalyptic viewpoint that you can go to the Bible and you can study, people say that, there's no error in the Bible. And if we study it enough, that we can show proof of anything. So proof of the future can be found in the Bible. I've heard some people discussing how the Bible proves how old the earth is, and that's why we shouldn't believe in archaeology. And I mean this is like recent people talking about this, that they go and they dive deep into these Bible verses to prove their own points. And I just think that's a dangerous way to read the Bible, because it's like what Mr. Dempsey said. You're taking your modern viewpoints and you're putting it on these authors that was never their intention. And I kind of like Dempsey says that they might be appalled by it, but it's so exhausting to me to talk to people that read the Bible that way, that it has to prove everything that's happening today. And I just don't think that's what the intention of the Bible ever was.
Well, and to go along with that, what Jane said, a lot of the way that I think some evangelicals interpret the Bible is completely out of context. Just what she said, they'll take, they'll do a proof text and they'll take a single verse out of context in relationship to the verses before it and the verses after it, and use that to prove a point. And that's in my opinion, that's a very dangerous way to use the Bible. And I think probably what Dempsey is going to tell us, I haven't read the book yet, but probably that we have to, look at the context of a lot of what the writers said, and recognizing that each one of them was an individual who lived in a different time and different circumstances.
Mhm.
But you can if you watch enough.
Detour.
What's that?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you watch enough evangelical TV preachers and listen to the sermons, that is exactly what they do. It's a verse at a time, and then we're on to another verse in some other book somewhere, and that they're trying to, make connections between all of these different events that probably were never meant to be connected in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the next slide, Dempsey says that there's 6 affirmations that he thinks comprise the basic message of the Bible. That's if we're on the prophetic path or the using the prophetic strand. And those 6 affirmations are: there is a loving God. All people have eternal worth. God wants people to be in the peaceable kingdom. In our vernacular is what we call Zion. God calls us to partnership in serving in the cause of Zion. Again, a restoration terminology there. God is Lord of the universe. It really is. He moves within history in realistic ways, not outside of history in unrealistic ways. And 6 is prophets speak for God by showing people how to change their lives by bringing a divine perspective to bear on their situation. Then he makes he says that biblical passages or modern teachings which with those 6 affirmations or contradict them should not be considered trustworthy, or they're not trustworthy. Then he goes on to say that these give our church, Community of Christ, 2 reasons for a powerful missionary message that we could bring. Community of Christ is uniquely in tune with God's vision of the cause of Zion, and Community of Christ is uniquely qualified to employ the power of the prophetic to serve the cause of Zion. What do you think in our history and scripture supports his 2 points there? Or do you think they do support it? Maybe you don't agree with what he says there.
Well, language that I grew up with in the probably 60s, 50s, and 60s was that we were a church that was going to build Zion. That's an action verb. Not that we were just going to wait for Zion to land on top of us, but we were going to be part of the process.
Okay.
Well, I'm
I
a little
think-
bit, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I remember as a child saying that it was our job to help build Zion. But then when we did it, when we accomplished it, Enoch was going to come down out of the sky and land on us. That was exciting for me as a child. So it was a little bit of both viewpoints, I guess, now that I'm thinking about it.
So you're thinking that part about that is apocalyptic and the other part was prophetic?
Yeah. Maybe my own childhood was both, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree
Well,
with that.
most of us live with. Uh-oh. Most of us live with contradictions in our own thinking.
Yeah. Good point.
Well, what does this require?
So Dennis, can I interrupt a minute?
Sure.
I think it's interesting that 30 years ago, Dempsey says all people have eternal worth.
Yeah, that struck me too, Karen. I don't remember when the worth of all persons language came into our church, but we didn't have the enduring principles yet in 1993. So all of that concept was there, but before enduring principles. So I really like how he said that.
But I would say, that was a principle that was in the early restoration, in the one of the first sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. It doesn't say exactly that way, but it says all persons are of worth or something like that. I'd have to look up this section of the Doctrine and Covenants that says that. So it's not a new concept for us.
Oh, good.
Back to this, what Dempsey says about these 2 reasons. What do you think that requires of, if we have this apocalyptic view, according to Jane, then maybe we have to have a more realistic understanding of the cause of Zion and what prophecy is. Isn't that what Grant McMurray was trying to say when of us becoming a prophetic people instead of a people with a prophet? Is that part of that more realistic understanding of prophecy? And then, like Jane said, do we need to discard the apocalyptic expectation of the coming forth of Zion?
I'd have to go back
ahead.
to go ahead, Ryan. You wanted to talk earlier and
Well-
I'm talking too much.
Well, there are certainly, for me personally, there's a lot of things of the early restoration that I do not affirm. I don't, Joseph Smith, a lot of things have been dispelled, I think, as part of our early myth making, but I I would have to hear an argument about why apocalyptic language is why we can move past that. I mean, I certainly don't. Um, I guess it seems like in this introduction, Dempsey is just kind of putting his cards on the table, but I haven't really heard his argumentation for these positions he has.
That's true. I kind of had a problem with, he made assertions in this introduction, and I haven't read the whole book, but I think he'll develop those or support those assertions as in the following chapters. So at least I'm hoping he's going to do that, because he doesn't really, footnote some of these points he makes. So I'm hoping that develops in the later chapters. That was one of my, like you, Ryan, is like, well, okay, so, give me some support, but this is just the introduction. So here's his concluding the introduction. He says he hopes his book will do three things. Give us a faith that isn't threatened by advances of science and philosophy, make us more committed to and optimistic, which I thought was we need, about the cause of Zion, and help others who maybe have faith issues because of these different strands contradicting with each other. So that's his hopes for his book. So let's move on to chapter 1, the tribal faith. And this is where he talks about there are 5 strands making up the basic foundation of modern Christian faith: tribal faith, international wisdom, Egyptian monotheism, Judean classical prophecy, and priestliness. And he says none of these strands are perfect. Then he starts talking about where did this all come from? And they all go back to what some call the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These were shepherds that lived around approximately 1700 BC, he says. And then this is, Jane brought this up. Dempsey says Abraham would have been shocked at the majestic creator found in Genesis. Why would Abraham be shocked about this concept of God, the majestic creator, in Genesis?
Well, I think maybe it has to do with things hadn't progressed that far yet. It was just sort of like the beginning ideas of, they had tribal gods. As
Okay.
the book points out, they were more henotheist than monotheist, and they had their own tribal god, which was more limited in power and what they did, I guess.
Well, I thought it was
Well,
interesting you pointed out that, did I hear Paul speak?
Well, I was just going to say, Abraham, according to the story in the Bible, came from Mesopotamia. He was not Judean. So he came out of a polytheistic background of, what today is Iran, Persia, and Iraq. And then, supposedly emigrated to Palestine, I guess. And then he,
Well,
he
what I
became,
thought was interesting was, go ahead.
no, well, I would say he ultimately, I think, became, or maybe is identified as the first monotheist, although if you look at the account of the story of Abraham when the strangers came to visit, those strangers, I think the Bible calls them gods. So there was more than one.
Yeah. Well, I thought the reason he would be shocked at this concept of the majestic creator that was the fact that that concept didn't exist in his time. The Genesis, that concept of God that you find in Genesis is 1,000 years after Abraham, according to Dempsey. So this idea didn't even exist in Abraham's time. That's why he'd be shocked to say, oh, there's this majestic creator versus his concept of a tribal God, which tells us another thing about the Bible is how did it come, what's it say about the development and order of the Bible? Well, it isn't a chronological, it wasn't developed chronologically, or it's not written that way. Genesis is the first book, but it's written by people following Abraham. So you're not following a chronological history in a sense of the way the book was actually written, or the books in the Bible were written. And so concepts that were later developments are put ahead of more primitive or earlier beliefs and practices. And so that kind of makes it difficult sometimes to understand the thinking. To me, it does. So here you have Abraham, hundreds of years before Moses, the 10 Commandments, prophets, Jesus, modern science. So what kind of religion did Abraham have? Was his religion any different from those of his neighboring shepherds?
Well, it's a little bit difficult to know because Genesis, it's written in the third person. It's not I, Abraham, this is my account. So um, I don't know. But what I was wondering is when or at the time of Abraham in the patristic era, what did they believe about creation? And did they believe that, the world has existed for all eternity, or was there a singular event? And I don't think that we'll find that in this chapter, but I was just curious about that.
That's a good question because I'm not sure. Well, I have to confess, I don't know my Old Testament good enough to tell you, Brian, where you could find that. I'm not sure it's actually in there about that, what their beliefs were. But
Well,
maybe you can learn that from. Go ahead, Jane.
I do think we have to look at it in terms of if he came from a polytheistic background. When you look at just, we read that book, History of God, and we've read, ancient religions and things like that. And so there were gods, there was the God of the sun and the God of the earth. And so creation was created by these multiple gods rather than this one God creating the earth. I think that is in all. I mean, I would say obviously the Greek gods were like that, but I think the Egyptian gods were like that too. It's like here's a god for everything that we see. So they would see the sunrise and say, "Oh, that's God," and that's when they were humanizing God so much. I think that's the background that he comes from.
well, and we did study that
Okay.
before, the Mesopotamian beliefs about creation. I think the name of the book or the writing was the Enuma Elish, if you remember that. And it talked about all those big battles between the gods, and they fought with one another. And as a part of all of the battles, that's where they believed the creation came from. We did talk about that. I know we had that in one of our classes.
I don't remember what book it
Okay.
was, Paul.
That was for my time, but maybe we can, if Dempsey's right, that,
I think it was the History of God book. I'm pretty sure that was the one that was the form written by the former nun, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah, I
PhD
think
candidate
that
lady.
was the book that talked about all of the ancient beliefs, and I'm pretty sure that she covered the Mesopotamian.
Okay.
Well,
okay,
and I
well,
wanted to add that, each part of the ancient civilizations all had their own creation stories. If you look at the Central Americans, they have, and I forget the name of their Popol,
Popol Vuh,
yeah, they have a really complicated creation story. And
Well, and the
then,
ancient,
the people of this continent have different creation stories that have to do with a lot of times corn and all that. So
and I
I
was just
would
going to say, go ahead, Coral.
no, that I basically was done. I was just going to say probably so Abraham's myth creation beliefs would have been probably from his Mesopotamian beliefs.
well,
Yeah,
that feeds in.
that was the point I was trying to make, was that's what his background was. And then I was going to say, a lot of what the Judeo-Christian tradition became incorporated those old beliefs. I know my Scandinavian ancestors believed that the first two people were created within a tree, and they called it the tree of life. Well, when the pagans in Scandinavia were converted to Christianity kept that notion of the tree of life, and we still talk about it, or at least we did in my lifetime.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this kind of comes out in, Dempsey says that Abraham's religion that we're talking about was similar to the surrounding peoples. He makes these 3 points that they both assumed a multiplicity of gods. They used the same pagan names for the gods, and they attributed the same human qualities and limitations for their gods. So that might help Ryan with saying, okay, if I understand the other religions, whether it's pointed out in the Bible, if their religions are similar to Abraham's, maybe you can derive some beliefs that Abraham would have had just by looking at surrounding religions. So each tribe had their own god, and this is called, Coral mentioned, henotheism. Dempsey says this is functional monotheism. Everyone had their own god, but they recognized that other tribes could have other gods. And so he makes some reference to some scriptures in the Bible, different verses where two people would make a contract. They would each cite or incorporate their God into this contract they made, because then if they had to keep they wanted to make sure they were on the right side of their God. So with both gods mentioned in the contract, that kind of was insurance that they would both obey the contract. That was one of the examples he gave in his book.
I think we should use that in modern contracts. If we put God in our contracts, maybe people won't break them. I don't know. I thought that was fascinating.
Well, you can try that on your next contract, Jane, see how it works.
Well, Jane, don't people swear on the Bible in court to tell the truth?
Oh no, not anymore. They just say,
Ah,
sometimes they say God, but they don't swear on a Bible anymore. They just hold up their hand.
Did they
So
say, "So help me God"? Or is
there
that
are
vary from
there
court
are
to
two
court?
versions. I've heard it both ways. I think if somebody prefers not to say "So help me God," they don't have to. It's just they affirm to tell the truth. So I'll go back. I'll go back and look at my oaths again, but it's not required like it used to be.
So if you're not a Christian, or you don't believe in the Bible,
Right.
Do you use some other book, or you just don't?
There's no book. You just raise your hand.
You just
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? And then that language, so help you God. That's what I can't remember if it's always there or not. It's there sometimes. You
Okay.
just raise up your hand to the judge. You don't put your other hand on anything.
Yeah, you just swear to tell the truth.
Yeah.
Okay.
in public before the judge.
You have to speak up if you're going to say things. Dempsey has two problems with the practice of henotheism. Because there's a multiplicity of gods, and people, they only want to please their God rather than necessarily dealing honorably with others. So he says it's really not an ethical situation. And he says, because we're at the mercy of the whims of the gods because they determine the course of events. So there's really no concept of cause and effect, or what we today would call the scientific method, no rational approach to reality. He thinks those are defects of the practice of henotheism. Then he gets into, I thought this was kind of interesting, when he says that in our modern translations, we use substitute words for what the Hebrew text, the original Hebrew text, uses for names of gods. So we might substitute words like Lord God or God Almighty for pagan names. And he gives an example here of Exodus 6 chapter verses 2 and 3 in the Hebrew text. It goes, and God said to Moses, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai. But by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. Well, in the NRSV, this passage uses Lord for Yahweh and God Almighty for El Shaddai. And you lose this context of these pagan names that were in the original Hebrew text. El Shaddai was the God of the mountains, according to Dempsey, and that kind of illustrates that they still had their nature gods in their belief system. And the danger to me, or I thought the interesting point he makes, is that because these texts use these substitutions, we don't recognize the primitive faith of the patriarchs, these allusions of pagan names that are found in the original text. It all gets like, well, this is the God Almighty, the majestic creator that modern people would believe in. It's all kind of not clear that they're using pagan names in their original text. But look on the other side. God is Yahweh according to Moses. He says, and God is the way Dempsey translated is the one who causes to be. I'm more familiar when Moses asks, he says, I am who I am. But this is according to Dempsey, it's the one who causes to be. But Moses is the beginning of monotheism for Israelites, but this is 500 years after Abraham. So he has a different concept, monotheism versus polytheism, or henotheism of Abraham. But back to Genesis, since it's the first book, I think this leads you to the belief that we've always had monotheism from the beginning of time with, Adam and Eve. In the story of Adam and Eve, you've got, before that, you've got this God creating the heavens, the earth. One God over the whole universe, which leads to thinking monotheism has always been around when it developed later, really, if you look at the way when the books were written. So the creation stories aren't history recorded from the time of Adam. They're a later effort by priests reinterpreting Middle Eastern assumptions in light of Israelite faith.
I think it's good too, Dennis, to recognize that not only was the creation story written long after that, but the stories of Abraham and Moses were also written long after that. So these are, they're all ancient stories that were handed down for a long time before they ever were put on papyrus or paper or whatever they used in those days.
Yeah, so you're saying that the story of Abraham and his faith wasn't written when he was on the journey.
Yeah, no, it wasn't written in 1700 BC. It was written after, probably sometime before or after the Babylonian captivity, I think, is when they date most of the writing of the Old Testament now.
Dempsey spends quite a bit of time on the belief of human-like limitations to God, and God having human-like characteristics and even having a physical body. He says that, long ago, the Israelites thought the gods were just superhumans who guided the forces of nature and society. But even after Moses, with his monotheistic vision, they still had these human-like characteristics for God. Now, his assumption is that the gods were human-like because the Israelites had a narrow worldview limited by their ability to visualize deity. And this is just like the Greek gods, the belief of the Greeks and their gods. But I've kind of wondered, when they use all these human terms, were they sometimes being metaphorical? Or did they have a literal belief in a physical body for God, and that he was, like God on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, looks just like us?
Well, there's one kind of interesting theory about how Yahweh got to be the one true God of Israel. As you mentioned earlier, El Shaddai was the God of the mountains, and Yahweh was actually the God of war in the polytheistic period for the ancient Palestine. And when Moses proclaimed that Yahweh was who they were going to follow from that point on, what scholars think, I'm not saying I agree or disagree, or you don't have to either, but what scholars think was that because the Israelites were in a condition where they were having to literally fight their way from city to city in order to establish themselves in, as the residents of ancient Israel, they needed a powerful warlike God. And so that's how Yahweh was selected as the one true God, because he was the God of war. And on some level, that makes some practical sense as to why the people may, have proclaimed Yahweh as the true God. Again, I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but that's just that's a modern theory.
Well, I wondered, how would we talk about God? I'm not saying that it's we should use human terms, but if we didn't use human terms, what would our language about God sound like? I mean, it's so easy to revert into talking about God as hearing and all these things, just like humans do. But this majestic creator, he's not, if he doesn't have human characteristics, then how do you would we be able to even talk about God if we didn't use human terms? Anybody have any ideas about that? Sharon?
Well, I don't think Native Americans get as tangled up in this as some other religions. What I know about Native Americans, I'm not an expert. God is simply the great spirit or the great mystery. And they don't seem to spend a lot of time trying to figure out the details.
Okay.
He's beyond understanding and beyond words.
I was reading a book about it talked about some Hopi Indian beliefs, and they, in their belief of God, one place he referred to them as referring to what we would call God as the I believe he called it there was a single consciousness in the beginning, which I thought was an interesting term. I've heard God referred as ground of being. I think that was some theologian named Tillich, I believe. So there's different ways for us, it becomes, I think, I wonder if it becomes kind of abstract when you don't use human terms.
Well, Dennis,
Do we still use human terms for God, Ryan?
well, you know, in one respect, I think that's why Jesus came to earth, to be the embodiment of God's spirit, if one subscribes to that. So what I mean is, yeah, we can't, it's hard to love an entity that is the ground of all being, but we can love individuals, and we can love Jesus and Jesus as the divine and so forth. So I think, you know, Jesus as the Word made flesh is something that we can grab onto in a personal way. So yeah.
Okay, we're not good at abstract thinking.
But you know, I wonder, you know, I do think that even though the ancient people had a different understanding than us, I don't think they were stupid that they couldn't understand metaphor. I think they certainly could. I would assume they could, because they had poetry back then, and so they had metaphorical language. But um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what literal things they believed. So
I was
yeah.
kind of the opinion that sometimes God is human-like in the Old Testament, and that's what they thought of him as. But other times, I kind of suspect that some of that's just metaphorical, because, like I'm just saying, I think it's hard to talk about God and not, if you don't use metaphorical words that are about human characteristics, then it's difficult. So I'm kind of a suspicion that there's some metaphorical language as well as a literal belief in a human-like God. So
I do think we as humans need metaphor. You know, I need the words comforter, you know, and your presence is with us. All that stuff that Dempsey was talking about, I use in many of my prayers, you know, so it kind of shocked me at first. It's like, oh, I really do put human terms to God still, because I am human. That's it. You know, I don't know how else to do it. But I think the reason why we're talking about Old Testament now is that they were much more literal about the human parts of God. I mean, there's a story in the Bible, and it even bothered me as a child, where if they were in war and these three guys stood at the top of the hill, and as long as their arms were up in the air, God was on their side. But if they got tired and their arms went down, then their armies would start losing, you know. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what kind of a God does that, you know? And so the Old Testament to me is a very warlike God. And maybe Paul's explanation is that's who Yahweh was. They were all fighting with each other so much because there was such a tribal viewpoint of who God was. But I don't know how to talk about God without putting myself into it somehow. I
okay,
like,
well, Jane, you probably answered this next question then about examples of how we give God human-like characteristics. So here's some. Sounds like
yeah,
you probably use these.
yeah. I don't think of him as a jealous God, though. I mean, I realize there's a lot of that language in the Bible, you know, and so maybe that's where Ryan and I kind of glob on to different parts of who God is. I look at the joy and the human emotions of comfort and love, and who Jesus was, and mostly, you know. I don't think of my God as being manipulative. I think of him as being all loving. And yes, but that still makes him personal.
Yeah. But in
I
some
don't
ways, I
think we
find
have
it.
any, I'm sorry, Dennis, I don't think we have any choice but to describe God in our own terms. I mean,
Yeah.
that's all we have,
Yeah.
you know, as our human experience.
Yeah.
And,
I do like
you know,
what
Joseph Campbell
Sharon,
we always said, you know, God created us in his image, and what Joseph Campbell would say is we've created God in our image.
yeah.
Well,
I
you
do,
know, when you think of a God that the majestic creator and the immensity of the universe, and it's so vast. Some of these human characteristics, I sometimes have difficulty thinking a creator like that could be so human-like. Anyway, that's
How many of us can even conceive of how big the universe is? It's almost beyond human thought
yes,
to come up with that and describe that. I mean, we do the best we can, but
yeah.
we're sort of limited in our viewpoint.
Some of these, like the James Webb Telescope and even the Hubble telescope before it, and other things that we've discovered with modern science, it's just like mind-boggling. Okay, so one thing he says about the patriarchs, a notable characteristic was their belief in a personal God. But then he says there was two limitations of their faith. We kind of talked about these. The universe wasn't coherent. They lacked a universal code of ethics. Their God had human limitations. We kind of talked about that. Is there some value in recognizing the primitive nature of their faith? Sharon again.
Well, I have to digress a moment here. I've always appreciated Mark Shearer's book about the history of our movement, and the title he chose, A Journey of a People. And I've always thought that the Bible should be titled that too. It's the journey of people trying to identify their relationship with God. And that's where I think many religious denominations kind of lose something when they think the Bible has all the answers. I think it has a lot of things for you to take with you on your journey, but the journey continues. I like knowing that belief about God has grown over time.
So that's that's what Dempsey calls the dynamic nature of our faith. Is it's grown and developed over time.
That's the
It's
value.
better than I could have said it. Thanks, Sharon.
That's the value of recognizing the primitive nature of faith, is that it was very primitive. It's very different than our own experience.
Well, I think we're about out of time. So we have different strands that have been added over time. This journey Sharon was talking about, journey of faith development, and we're going to, in subsequent chapters, we will cover some of these different strands that have been added to grow into the monotheistic faith of Moses and later prophets. And Jane, I assume, Jane, you're going to lead the discussion next week on the international wisdom strand.
yeah, I think so. That's chapter 2.
Chapter 2.